Welcome back. And this is the remainder of the medieval period for Music 101. We left off with Gregorian chants being the basis of medieval music. By the time we get to about the year 1000, they're getting a little bored with chant. And they're looking for some ways to dress it up, to make it more interesting, to make it more elaborate, especially on the big feast days when you've got the chants that have lots and lots of notes in them. So one of the things that they did was to try to put another line running in parallel with the chant line, so that somebody would be singing what we would today call harmony along with it. Now that may sound pretty obvious to us today, but that was literally a fork in the road for music, because nobody in any other culture has done that since then. And that really sets the groundwork for our Western music that we know today, having layer upon layer upon layer of musical things happening in the same musical composition. So one of the first places that this happened, and I'm just going to play with the screen here for a minute, is at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. And in Notre Dame, as you know, there was a building boom, or as you maybe know, there was a building boom in Europe through the 11 and 1200s of all these humongous Gothic cathedrals. And the word Gothic refers to a particular architecture style. It was preceded by something we call Romanesque. As in the style of the ancient Roman Empire, they continued to build big buildings modeled after the buildings of the late Roman Empire up until the late 900s, year 1000. Then they came up with the brilliant idea that if you take an arch, which the Romans invented, and you slightly point it, it becomes stronger. And because of that, with pointed arches, they could build buildings that were taller. They could put more windows in them. They also came up with the idea of flying buttresses, which are these external skeletons on a building that keep the walls from falling over. And with these architectural innovations, they were able to build these massive cathedrals. And in an incredible case of keeping up with the Joneses, once one city got one, every city wanted one, and every bishop wanted one of these massive cathedrals in his city. So maybe the most famous of all is Notre Dame in Paris, which, as you all probably remember, burnt about a year ago and is currently under restoration. It was started in 1160 AD, and it took almost 100 years to build. And they finally completed the facade, which is the entrance side, what you see looking at the front of it, in the year 1250. So there's our Gothic architecture style. Tall buildings with vaulted ceilings. That means the ceilings aren't flat like in a Roman building, but the ceilings are pointed and have arches coming across that are defining the ceiling. The columns that hold up the roof are not big, thick, massive stone columns, but they tend to be a little more slender. We have lots and lots of stained glass windows that allow a lot of light to come in. And this is all made possible by pointed arches. Here are some pictures of Notre Dame in Paris. You can see the facade on the left, very symmetrical. It's 3 sections wide and 3 sections tall. And the facade actually covers the shape of the building behind it, because the building isn't square like that, but it has a tall central portion and 2 shorter side portions. On the right side, you can see the rear end of the church and all those supports, which are called buttresses, holding up the walls. And you can see the walls are mostly glass. They're mostly windows letting light in. And what allows them to be so tall and to hold and to have that much glass in them are these flying buttresses. And there's Notre Dame in its entirety. You can see how it's very sectioned. Each section has a buttress holding it up. And on the inside, those also correspond to columns holding up the ceiling. We call each of those sections a bay. That's how it looked before the fire. The great central flesh in the middle, of course, burnt and fell through the roof and will hopefully someday be rebuilt. So there were two important composers associated with Notre Dame who made some early experiments in what we call polyphony or polyphonic music, which is music with several voices going on at the same time. These earliest experiments in music in parts are called organum. There's a vocabulary word for you, organum. And organum consists of a Gregorian chant part sung by the tenor, from the Latin word tenere, to hold, the part that has the chant, that holds the chant. And above that, one or two additional parts that are weaving kind of circles in the air, arabesques of sound, over the held notes of the organum. So here's an example from the first composer, a man named Leonin, who lived while the church was still under construction. Oh, unavailable. Let me give you a new one. There we go. Oops, wrong one. Oh. There we go. Notice on the bottom is a long held note. It looks like there's nothing, but there's a note at the very beginning. And on the top are those little moving notes in the upper part. The bottom note is the first note of the Gregorian chant. And now it just changed to the second note. And above this example, you can see what it'll look like in original chant notation. Very different than what we're used to listening to today, but if you close your eyes, it transports you to a different time and realm of existence. Oh, let me get rid of this. There we go. So this organum, composed by Leonin, sometimes in two parts, sometimes in three parts, was contained in a book called The Big Book of Organum, the Liber Magnum Organi. And then a generation later, his student, Periton, took these and added yet another line on top. So now we have 3 and 4 voice organums, which again include the Gregorian chant sung in really long held notes, and then these very florid, very active, very busy lines on top of it. This wouldn't be an entire Gregorian chant, or it would take hours to get through it. They would just take small sections of the chant to do this. So here's Periton's version of the same chant. And look at the tenor on the bottom. See how he's just holding one long note, the first note of the chant, while all this stuff is going on. Now, this isn't done by a choir. This would be done by one person on each voice part. And finally gets to the second syllable of the Gregorian chant. and so on. So this early organum style continues to develop. And by the 1300s, we get maybe the greatest composer of the late medieval period, Guillaume de Machaut. Machaut was educated in the church, but he was known as a poet. He was hired by the King of France and lived in Reims, which was the royal city of France at the time, wrote poetry and wrote music. And then he had the brilliant idea to commission someone to prepare a book containing everything that he had written and composed. That book went onto a shelf in a library, and 700 years later, it was discovered, and we now know of all those composers at that time, only Machaut's music, because he had the foresight to promote himself by having everything that he composed written and put into a book. It's a chance of history, but fortunately we have this wonderful treasury of music that Machaut wrote. So the style that Machaut wrote in, or the genre literally that he wrote in, is called motet, from the French word mot, which means a word. And motets start as a way of elaborating chant, just as organum did. But they weren't meant to be done in the church. The organums were all done as part of Gregorian chant. They were done in the religious ceremonies. The motets are what we call secular music, music of the world, or popular music, you could say. And they were done for the enjoyment of the people who worked in the church on their off hours. A motet would take a Gregorian chant line, and it would be very much like organum. It would have these busy other lines on top of it, but instead of singing just one long word, they would put poetry in there. And each part would have its own poem, either in French or in Latin. So you might have one part singing French, a lower part singing Latin, and the bottom is a word from a Gregorian chant, all going on at the same time. Here's an example from Machaut called Las Comment oublierais. And we've got 3 different parts going on at the same time. And so on. You see on the screen, there's a line of text, Las Comment oublierais, and a slash. That's what the top person is singing. Then you see Si je mon ami, that's what the middle person is singing. And you see Pourquoi me bat mes maris, which is what the lower person is singing. So 3 different French texts going on at the same time, sung by 3 people. This music isn't really meant for the listener. This is music that's more fun for the singers than it is for the listeners. And at a time when people were making music for their own entertainment, singing this was the entertainment, and figuring out the notation and singing these texts, which are sometimes a little racy, sometimes a little political. And it's entertaining for the people who are actually doing the singing, more so than it is for the listeners. Machaut also, oh, well, there we are, 3 voices singing 3 different texts. There's the 3 texts. Each voice has a different speed, a different rhythm, and a different melody. So we call this polyphonic texture, many voices going on at the same time. Finally, I want to take a minute and talk about a female composer, Hildegard of Bingen, who lived in the 1100s most of her life. Hildegard was a visionary. She was a religious woman. She was recognized by the church as somebody special, and she was also an author and a composer. She had visions from God that she would write down and send around, and people would come to find out what her communications from God were. There she is, hearing from God and writing something herself, and also dictating to a scribe. She composed music, and there's a manuscript from her time of one of her compositions. She followed the rule of Saint Benedict, which was the rule that set the way that monks and nuns lived in religious communities during the medieval period. And the idea of living in a community of men or a community of women and following a daily schedule of prayer and work was very attractive, was very respected, and was followed by a lot of people. And some famous monasteries like Cluny in France, and some famous convents like Hildegard's convent in Bingen were known around the Christian world. Incidentally, some of these monasteries were the places that produced the manuscripts that we've been talking about when we talk about those beautiful illuminated manuscripts. So she founded an order. She was the head of her own convent. She had these visions, and then she wrote a play we would call it a morality play, called The Book of Virtues, the Ordo Virtutatum. And in this play, there are 7 women playing the 7 virtues, and they're all having an argument with the devil, who's trying to talk them out of being virtuous. And at the end, they tie him up and they carry him away. So virtue wins out over temptation. Here is a little bit of a dramatization of it that was done. This is, I believe, a Polish video. And you can hear a little bit of her musical style. Sounds a little bit like Gregorian chant. And here you hear how Hildegard really kind of understood the female voice. And although she's writing in a chant idiom, the music just works so much better in the female voice, explores the range of it, and is very almost ecstatic sometimes. This music is still what we would call monophonic, music with just one part, one melody. And it's worth noting that this is going on at the same time that these other experiments in organ and polyphonic music are going on. Even though we see this set in a church, this isn't religious. Just happens to be using a church as a performance space. If you want to see more of this video, you'll see the link up here that you can click on as part of this presentation, and it'll take you to the full YouTube video. And that pretty much wraps up our medieval period. Next lecture, we'll start talking about the Renaissance. So the medieval period, 1,000 years dominated by the Catholic Church. Most of the music we have from this period is religious music, very little non-religious, some instrumental music, some songs sung by maybe the Crusaders and things like that, but mostly religious music, tons and tons of it. The invention of notation happens during this time and prepares the way for the Age of Discovery, which we'll address in the next lecture. Thank you.